Welcome. Welcome to week 5 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies Applied Intelligence. Just announcements, a week from, or today, or whenever you're watching this, November 24th, we're going to have a Zoom conference session. Groups 1, 2, and 3 will brief. Again, that's 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be sure to prep with a PowerPoint presentation, about 20 minutes or so, give or take. Make sure you send the PowerPoint slide to me ahead of time so I can upload it into the Zoom. You will get a Zoom link this week, and that will be where you guys meet to congregate. Just a couple of one quick tip. I understand that if you can't make it and you are in groups 1, 2, and 3, don't worry about it. Just as long as you distribute the work so that if your absence, or you do work on the presentation, so you don't have to be at the Zoom session. I know people are on shift work or they're in different time zones, and coming in at 9 p.m. Might be an issue. So I just wanted to extend that out. If you can't make it and you're in groups 1, 2, and 3, understand. Just make sure at least one person is able to brief. Groups 4 and 5, your paper will be due that day. At 11:59 Eastern Standard Time. If you're welcome to attend the group session, but I can imagine that most of you will be finishing up your paper that night, or some of you will be finishing up your paper that night. So just keep that in mind going forward. Just key date, again, November 24th, Sunday, 9 p.m. Zoom session, and you will get the link going forward. And I'll give guidance on the paper in this session. So week 4 review. Two case studies, Iraq WMD and 9/11 case study. Iraq WMD. So there's failures, again, along the chain. There was failures in collection, and I think the 60 minutes on Curveball really highlighted that just basic collection human principles failed. The interrogation of al-Libi, or taking human information from al-Libi, who was the person under torture in Cairo, claimed that Saddam Hussein was giving VX gas to al-Qaeda terrorists. That was a collection failure as well. Analytical failures, and again, we saw those up and down the chain, but I think the aluminum tube fiasco, for lack of a better term, represented an analytical failure. Basic analysis, groupthink, confirmation bias contributed to that. Also, a just lack of basic scientific understanding of aluminum tubes. Now, that information was available by the Department of Energy and their analysts, but it was ignored by other analysts in the community. There are other analytical failures. Negative evidence. I've mentioned this a couple of times. There was a lot of information or a lot of questions that asked, where is the WMD? The question that was not asked was, if there is a large-scale chemical program, a nuclear program, why are we not seeing X, Y, and Z? That was, again, a failure in analysis conducted by the intelligence community. There was organizational failures. As I mentioned in the lecture, if you can do all the red teaming and wargaming and alternative analysis and Team A and Team B that you studied in your last class, but if George Tenet says it's a slam dunk case that there's Iraq WMD, that's it. And that represents, again, a failure in organization where intelligence is dependent on one person and his biases and what he wants to do. That's a failure in intelligence. You also saw in the Rachel Maddow documentary, an alternative structure of intelligence was fed to policymakers in a manner that confirmed their own predilections. Now, many would argue that's not an intelligence failure. That's a failure in policy. But I would just still say that the organization was structured in a way that led to bad information rising to the top. And then yet again, the policy interface, that's really covered in the Rachel Maddow. And it's very difficult sometimes to separate the failures in intelligence and the failures on the policy interference or interface, because arguably those aluminum tubes wouldn't have been evaluated if there weren't impetuous by policymakers to push for an Iraq nuclear nexus. Arguably, Curveball and his fake analysis of bioweapons, that would not have gone up in the policy. That intelligence wouldn't have been bad or uncorroborated if it weren't for policy impetuous to get information, to get any information that you can. So, I separated them in the lecture, but it's kind of hard to separate them in practicality. So obviously, yeah, the policy interface, Intel policy interface here was dysfunctional, to put it mildly. And then we go to the 9/11 case study. I asked this question: was 9/11 an intelligence failure? Arguably, no, it wasn't. Not all bad things that happen. The shooting that just happened in Santa Clarita yesterday, that's a bad thing. Probably is not an intelligence failure per se. So arguably, 9/11 is not an intelligence failure. It's a free country. People can travel here. 19 shadowy groups coming in, conducting an attack might be difficult to pick up. And I might agree with that until I saw the NSA documentary where there were 2 known hijackers in the country, known to our intelligence community, but for whatever reason, information was not disseminated properly. That is an intelligence failure. Arguably as well that the intelligence community and the civil aviation community should have been aware that a plane could have been used in a Tomahawk missile the way it was on 9/11. I'll let you decide on whether you think that was a reasonable conclusion in our pre-9/11 time frame. One question I want to ask: what do you do when Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S.? Unfortunately, you couldn't watch National Geographic, and maybe I'll assign the Disney Channel for my next class coming up. Although I did see someone had the YouTube out, so if you were able to see it, that's please do, because it might help on the paper. But one of the questions that came up, it was briefed to Bush: Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. I never liked that this was an intelligence failure, or this was a failure that George Bush failed to heed his warnings. That briefing was far too vague. It was not enough, and as I've mentioned before, for there to be reasonable countermeasures taken to mitigate risk. I worked with a bunch of civil aviation folks. They might disagree. They might say if you get a vague warning, like Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S., you automatically go to civil aviation and you secure civil aviation. I'll let you decide if that's good, but they do have a reasonable point that terrorists come to civil aviation often, and if you get a nebulous warning like that, that's your first go-to move. I'll let you decide on that. Organizational issues. Again, as I mentioned, information was collected at the highest levels of our federal government, but due to personalities, as you saw in the NSA documentary, due to classification issues, due to no interagency sharing agreements, due to our federal government, our federal list government, where information at the federal level is not disseminated down to state and local officials, that information was not given a proper reason. And again, that was a failure in an organization. And then I ask, as we go forward, where along the chain could federal and state government have prevented a 9/11? Is it possible to prevent or would it something like this still happen now? And could something be done in the 9/11 case study that would prevent terrorist incidents that we're going to see in week 5? Again, I'll let you decide on that. So paper 2. I'm going to give some guidance here, just some points that I consider. I don't want laundry lists on paper 2. Don't give me 15 reasons why 9/11 occurred or 15 reasons why Iraq WMD occurred. That is not what I want. Focus on 1 to 2 issues and go in depth. That is a better paper than laundry lists of 15 issues or something along those lines. So please keep that in mind as you're writing your papers this week. And, again, the strategic paper, you can go by the case studies and go in depth. You can choose another case study that we haven't discussed. And if you're going to do that, please give me a heads up on that case study. I want to study this because I want to just make sure that it's a worthy case study and you're on the right track. So allow you to choose a case study and then go in depth. What do you think the failure was? In the Yom Kippur lecture on the Yom Kippur War and the Pearl Harbor, I gave you a multitude of reasons why Pearl Harbor failed or why the Israeli intelligence failed to pick up the Arab attacks during the Yom Kippur War. I want you to decide which one of those was the primary factor and prove that factor for me. Please do that. That is the guidance for this paper. I will also allow you to choose an issue and show how that issue weaved its way through the intelligence community, whether that issue was negative evidence, and you can show how multiple case studies contributed to that negative evidence, whether that's collection failures, and show how failure occurred through the multiple case studies. You choose one of the issues that we've discussed in depth. And some of the issues that we have discussed in depth: failures in collection, Pearl Harbor, again, the inability to collect on the Japanese aircraft carriers, their key strategic issues. Yom Kippur War, the reliance on one human source. That was a failure in collection. There's other failures in the Yom Kippur War I'm not going to bring up here, but that was one I'm just using as an example. And then Iraq War, I just talked about the failures in human. Failures in analysis, Pearl Harbor. And again, these were failures that the commanders made, whether it's failure to understand the mindset of Japanese, failure to understand the indicators that many of you discussed. What were the failures in analysis? The confessions we talked about in depth, confirmation bias, vividness bias, all those biases that people had contributed to that essential intelligence failure at the state and municipal level. And then Iraq WMD, you had groupthink, you had negative evidence. I just went into most of those that were failures in analysis that were illustrating the Iraq WMD case study. Politicization, Iraq WMD. I don't need to go in more depth there. I just covered a lot of it. The confessions. This was another case where politicization, essentially, pressure to falsify evidence to get a conviction, forced people to make decisions that were ridiculous in hindsight. And then 9/11, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, talk about and the Dahl talks about it in general. Arguably, the intelligence was somewhat accurate. They had an understanding of the threat, but they couldn't communicate this to policymakers or get it through the policy interface. Why? And the Dahl does a pretty good job of explaining it. And then organization, 9/11, I talked about this. Pearl Harbor was another case study where information was at the federal level, at the G2 Army staff level, and based on encrypted data or intercepted data, but it was not disseminated down to the military leaders at Pearl Harbor. That's a failure in bureaucracy and organization. And then the fusion centers, which are designed to push information down to lowest levels, but obviously doesn't always work. And the question is, why? Why is that organization still breaking down? So those are some examples. And again, I don't want a laundry list. I'm just using this to kind of stimulate your mindsets for this paper and give you a little bit more guidance. What I don't want is for you to talk about week 5 in this paper. Week 5 case studies are meant for a future paper, so be cognizant of that. And then, because it's, again, this course is compressed, this degree is compressed, I wish I could give you a full week to work on paper 2, but I can't. we have to continue on with the case studies. And for this case study, again, we look at the counterterrorism case studies. And we're shifting to counterterrorism, criminal intelligence next week, and then business intelligence the following week. So the tracks that you're in for this course. So counterterrorism case studies. We're going to look at Fort Hood, 2009, underwear bomber, Boston, and the European Union. You have the readings on the Fort Hood shooting and the Boston Marathon bombing, the congressional report. And then you have the documentary Christmas Day Bomber, EU Terrorism, PBS Frontline. And the question to ask is, why do we still have these failures? Why, despite the billions, trillions, depending on how you count it, do we still have intel failures that occur and that continue to occur? So I look forward to your discussions. I look forward to the Zoom session next week. And if there's questions or issues, don't hesitate to reach out to me over email. We can even arrange a Skype call or a normal call if you have questions or issues. I am available to answer those going forward. And again, I look forward to the Zoom session next week. And don't hesitate to ask me any questions.